Dylan Hartley wasn't the type to run away from life's scars. He carried them on his shoulders in his weary gaze and in the way he avoided questions about his past. When he accepted the job of restoring the Greystone Lighthouse, he did so with a clear purpose: to disappear from the world, from memories, and most importantly from himself. The offer seemed too good to be true. A historic preservation company was offering a 2-month contract, upfront payment, on-site accommodations, and creative freedom to restore the lighthouse to its original glory. Located on a secluded island off the east coast, accessible only by private boat and dependent on the tides, the lighthouse had been completely defunct since the 1960s. Dylan didn't think twice. He packed up his truck, brought tools, canned food, and a few old books, and set off. The crossing was made by a fisherman named Amos, a thin, stooped man with calloused hands and hooded eyes. During the voyage, Amos didn't say much, but when the lighthouse finally appeared in the mist, a dark silhouette against the pale sky, he muttered something that Dylan didn't understand until the boat docked at the rotting pier. "Don't stay when the light is gone. Not all darkness is night." Dylan just nodded, thinking it was some local superstition, but the phrase stuck to his mind like wet seaweed on his skin. The island was small, rocky, covered in low-lying grass and gnarled trees that looked as if they had grown to outrun the wind. Greystone Lighthouse stood in the center of the landscape, like a bony finger pointing to the heavens. Its base was wide, built of ancient black stone, covered in moss and saltpeter. The structure looked sturdy, but decades of neglect were clearly etched into the cracks and rust. The first night was silent, but the kind of silence that weighs heavily. Even with the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks, there was something absent, as if the world around them had been muffled. No seagulls, no insects, not even the sound of the wind blowing through the cracks, just the sound of their own blood rushing in their ears. Dylan fired up the small gasoline generator he'd brought with him and plugged in basic lights inside the tower. He climbed the spiral steps to the top to assess the condition of the lantern. The glass was cracked in several places, and the rotating mechanism was jammed with rust. But the strangest thing was the center of the lens. There was a faint greenish glow there, pulsing as if it were breathing. He blinked several times. He thought it was a reflection from the generator below. He ignored it. For the first few days, he worked hard. He cleaned the interior, cleared away debris, dismantled some of the old electrical system, and made notes about what he would need to buy for the next transport. But something kept creeping up on the island, an uneasy feeling, as if he were being watched. Every now and then, he would feel a change in the air pressure, a high-pitched ringing in his ears, and a presence that seemed to be lurking just out of sight. One afternoon, while removing wooden planks from the ground floor, he found a narrow staircase behind a false wall. It led down to a basement that was not listed on any of the plans he had received from the company. Curious, he grabbed a flashlight and went down. The place was damp, covered in slime, and filled with old boxes containing rusty tools, rotting, books, and something curious, symbols carved into the stones. Some resembled letters, others looked like eyes. In the far corner, protected by carefully placed boards, he found a metal box. Inside was a diary, wrapped in dry linen cloth yellowed with age. The leather cover was cracked but still legible. At the top, handwritten in shaky letters, it said, H. Strayer, Record of the Last Guardian. Dylan took the diary up to the top of the lighthouse that night. He sat in an old chair with an oil lamp and began to read. What he found there were not just memories of a lonely man. They were alerts, desperate screams between the words, records of strange events that at first seemed like delusions. But as he read, he began to find parallels between what Strayer had written and what he himself felt. The pressure in the air, the whispers in the night, the feeling of being watched. The last passage he read before falling asleep said, "The light is not just light. It is a seal, a barrier. The eye still watches from the abyss. As long as it shines, it does not rise. But if it fails, it returns, and no one can stop it." Dylan woke up in a cold sweat, as if he had spent the entire night struggling to breathe. The next morning, the seagulls had returned, but they were dead on the beach, 15 of them, uninjured, just dead. Dylan was not superstitious, at least it hadn't been until then, but finding those dead seagulls lined up on the sand as if they had fallen from the sky in exactly the same spot and in the same direction stirred something primitive in his brain. It wasn't just strange, it was symbolic, and symbols, he was beginning to understand, had real weight in this place. He took one of the bodies to the makeshift laboratory at the base of the lighthouse. He examined it superficially. No visible injuries, no blood, No signs of attack, just glassy eyes and slightly open beaks, as if they had died of fright. Remembering the diary, he returned to the basement entrance, looking at the symbols carved into it. He began to copy some of them into a notebook. It was all very crude, but there was a pattern, an eye, a spiral around it, and something that looked like bars or grates, like a prison carved into stone. That night the generator failed for the first time. Dylan had filled up the tank late in the afternoon, as usual, but around 2 a.m. he was awakened by a darkness so thick it felt heavy. The lighthouse, now plunged into shadow, made not a sound, nor did the wind howl. Leaving his room with his handheld flashlight, he went down to the generator room. As he got closer, he noticed a strong smell of iron, like fresh blood, and to his surprise, the tank was intact, full, but he didn't care. When he tried to manually start it, the engine sputtered 3 times, and then on the 4th he heard it, a whisper. It came from outside the tower, low, drawn out like a whale swallowed by the mist. Dylan froze. Holding his breath, he moved closer to the narrow window. He saw nothing but absolute blackness. But the whispering continued. It seemed to circle the tower, as if something was slowly walking around it, scratching at the stones with fingers that weren't fingers. Strayer wasn't crazy, he muttered to himself. He knew. When the generator finally started up again, on its own, without any intervention, Dylan ran to the top of the tower. The lens still glowed that faint green, but now cracks were radiating out from the center, as if something was pressing against it, something trying to get out. He spent the next few days in a state of constant alert. He began to sleep during the day and keep watch at night, noting every noise, every change in the wind, every interference in the behavior of the birds, the waves, or even the light. And the light seemed to grow weaker and weaker. No matter how much he cleaned the lens, no matter how much he adjusted the mirrors, it simply no longer reached the same beam as before, as if the very essence of the lighthouse was fading away. One particularly cloudy afternoon, Dylan decided to explore the basement again. This time, he took the journal and compared the symbols with the carvings in the stone. He discovered something new, a small compartment embedded behind an old mortar wall. Using a chisel and patience, he pried open the space, revealing a smaller black wooden box tied with thick rope and covered in wax. Inside there were 3 objects: a greenish crystal, the size of a closed fist wrapped in silver and copper lines, an iron medallion with the same inscription as at the top of the diary, "Light of darkness bound. Light binds darkness." A parchment written in a language he didn't recognize, with circular, almost serpentine words. As he touched the crystal, he felt a wave of nausea, as if his head were being pulled into it. He saw an image, quick and clear, of something gigantic emerging from a dark abyss, with eyes like beacons and tentacles that trailed for miles beneath the water. And then the image was gone. Screaming, Dylan dropped the crystal, but to his horror, it didn't hit the floor. He disappeared into thin air. That was the breaking point. He knew he had to get out of there. He radioed to Amos, asking for urgent evacuation, but there was no response. That night a storm began, and the lighthouse, for the first time since Dylan's arrival, went completely dark. The crystal had been part of the seal. It had broken something. The waves crashed against the rocks with a new fury, as if the sea itself were trying to warn him. The wind blew like angry voices, and between each clap of thunder, Dylan thought he heard his name being called. No, shouted, as if something far below was waking from a hungry slumber. He climbed to the top of the tower again, journal in hand. He reread the last few pages. Strayer wrote of the final vigil, when he knew the light would fade and the seal would give way. He mentioned a sealing rite, but the last page was stained with something too dark to be ink. Dylan closed the book. He looked out the window, and then he saw it, far away beyond the horizon, a silhouette, huge, almost motionless, like an island where there was none, and then a glow, green, like an eye opening in the ocean. The submerged eye had awakened. What Dylan saw that night was not a delusion. The figure in the sea was real, a silhouette that blocked out stars and seemed to breathe along with the ocean. At first, he thought it was an illusion caused by the storm, but when the rain stopped and the sea receded, she was still there, motionless, as if watching back. He tried to sleep, but he couldn't. His body was shaking, his heart was racing for no reason, and a lingering metallic taste filled his mouth. When he looked in the mirror the next morning, he noticed that he had dark circles under his eyes and a slight yellowing, as if he were transforming into something that was no longer completely human. On the third night, without radio response, Dylan climbed back to the top of the tower and noticed that the mirrors were streaked with marks, not from dirt or salt spray, but from tiny fingerprints, long and thin, like claws dragged across glass. No cameras had been installed, so he rigged one up with his cell phone, pointing it at the inside of the lighthouse lens. He had to figure out what was going on. He spent the rest of the day immersed in Harold Strayer's diaries, and then he found a previously ignored section, pages glued together with wax as if the old guardian did not want them opened unless there was no alternative. He tore them open carefully and read them. The words were shaky, desperate. The light does not shine it contains. The creature is not frightened by the brightness. It is trapped by it. It is like chaining a predator in a circle of fire. The problem is that fire does not last forever. The sunken eye has no true form. It molds itself to the mind of the one who observes it. Each one sees something different, but they all share one certainty: it must not exist. Eventually the light will fade. The creature will try to touch the earth again, and if the seal is broken, there will be no way to drive it out. It won't just come, it will spread. The last lines were scratched as if written with one's own nails. Something in Dylan broke in that instant. He was no longer just a man isolated in an old lighthouse. He was the last guard of an interdimensional prison, and the lock was about to fail. It was then that he remembered the camera. He ran to the top and checked the footage. At first nothing out of the ordinary, but as the early morning hours wore on, the video caught a chilling moment. At 3:42 a.m., the headlight lens went dark for a second, and something seemed to emerge from behind the glass. A humanoid shape, but too long, with spindly arms and eyes glowing the same green as the missing crystal. The image lasted only half a second, but Dylan paused and zoomed in. The face was a mix of human and abyssal features, and most frightening of all, it wore the same medallion he had found in the hidden box. Something, or someone, had stepped out of the beam of light, or maybe it was trying to get in. With shaking hands, Dylan hurried down the stairs. He needed to reactivate the seals. But how? The scroll he had found was in an unknown language, and he had already touched the crystal, compromising part of the protection. That's when a new idea came to mind. What if there were more records? Something Strayer couldn't finish? He remembered the place where he had found the first diary. Near the basement beams was a small opening sealed with old nails. He grabbed a sledgehammer and started hitting with the fury and desperation of someone trying to break their own destiny. Inside, there was another box, smaller, made of lead. When he opened it, he found more sheets of paper, faded photos, and a map of the coast with circles drawn around specific points in the sea. One of the circles was directly under the lighthouse with a note in shaky letters: primary door, never turn off. The lighthouse wasn't just a seal, it was a braid about direct entry into the creature's domain. What Dylan had feared was now true. The sunken eye wasn't coming. It was already there, just contained, and now free to lurk again. During the night, as he was rereading the pages, he heard a strange sound coming from the spiral staircase. Footsteps. Slow, dragged, frozen. He turned off the light and leaned against the wall. The footsteps stopped. The silence lasted for eternal minutes. Then a voice whispered next to his ear, "You saw me." He turned with a scream, but there was no one there. And yet, something lingered in the air, as if that presence had left part of itself behind. The books around him were damp, smelling of mud and rust. His flashlight began to fail, and through the intermittent darkness, he caught a glimpse in the ancient mirror in the hallway. For an instant he was there himself, but with black irisless eyes and tentacles coming out of his mouth. The next day, Dylan began having visions in broad daylight. Dead fish in the sink, a body floating outside the window, then gone. The sound of bells ringing out to sea even though there was no boat. And a song, a dissonant, almost hypnotic melody that seemed to emanate from deep within the rocks. He tried to cover his ears, but the music came from inside his own head. Little by little, he began to forget small details. Dates, names, how the generator worked, what it was doing there. It was as if the sunken eye wasn't just manifesting itself, it was corroding Dylan's mind. But there was one last entry in Strayer's journal, a mention of final anchoring, an emergency ritual for when the seals had been broken and the containment seal had given way. A last-ditch effort to reconnect the light to the creature's dimensional prison. But it was dangerous. If performed incorrectly, it said, the soul of the performer may become part of the cell. Dylan knew he wouldn't get another chance, but to perform the ritual he first needed to retrieve the crystal, the anchor, the one that had disappeared, and that meant doing something unthinkable. go down to the base of the cliff, and face the crevice. The wind howled around the cliff as Dylan prepared to descend. The base of the lighthouse was inaccessible by the common trail. The real path to the cleft, according to the old maps, was hidden among the slippery rocks that lined the sea. The morning fog seemed to come alive, wrapping everything in a cold, damp blanket. With a backpack containing flashlights, the journal, and makeshift tools, he made his way down carefully. Each step seemed to echo louder than it should, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. He thought of Strayer's warnings, that here, on the border between two worlds, perception became distorted. What Dylan didn't expect was that the crack, when he finally saw it, looked like a huge gash in the rocks, too deep for the eye to see all the way to the bottom. The dark water bubbled and gushed out a fine mist, laden with a salty, metallic, almost putrid smell. As he approached, the sound of the sea was replaced by a murmur, almost like distant voices. He tried to look into the crevice, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light of his flashlight. Something was pulsing inside, a rhythmic vibration that he had felt before as a tightness in his chest. A sudden crack made him look back. A quick shadow crossed the rocks, but when he looked, there was nothing but mist. His heart raced. He recalled that the diary mentioned symbols carved into the stones, part of the ancient containment ritual. He began to search, feeling invisible, fingers brush against the back of his neck. That was when he saw, engraved in the rock beside the crevice, an incomplete circle, what looked like an ancient inscription eroded by time. He tried to trace the symbol with his fingers, and the moment he did, an electric current ran through his arm as if something underground was waking up. Dylan swallowed the urge to retreat. He needed to find the crystal, his only hope. The mist within seemed to take shape, a living mass that molded itself between sea and stone. A low sound, almost like a collective whisper, began to surround him, sounds that his brain struggled to comprehend. The voices carried promises and threats, mixed in a language that was not human. He realized that the creature didn't need to appear to dominate the place. Its presence was enough to turn everything into a sensory nightmare. Trying to remain calm, Dylan collected water and rock samples for analysis and continued on. And that's when he felt the ground shake beneath his feet. A crack opened up beside him, exuding a deep green light, the same shade as the crystal and the light from the lighthouse. Fear took hold of him, but curiosity and need were greater. With cautious steps, Dylan approached the crack, which opened like a wound in the earth, revealing something that looked like a pulsating portal, a thin, translucent membrane that vibrated and emitted an unsettling hum. He reached out his hand, and at the moment of contact, a vision washed over him. Fragmented images of indescribable beings, raging seas of energy, worlds beyond human comprehension. Dylan recoiled in fright, his body breaking out in a cold sweat. The feeling of being watched intensified, as if 1,000 invisible eyes were staring at him from the shadows of the crevice. Returning to the lighthouse, fatigue began to weigh on him. The voices, the visions, the constant feeling of being disintegrating into himself did not leave him, but he knew there was still more to discover, and that the line between wakefulness and collapse was growing ever thinner. Back at the lighthouse, Dylan felt the weight of every second, his mind clouded by the whispers and visions of the rift. That night, the storm seemed to come to life, beating furiously against the windows, as if it wanted to tear out the secrets hidden within those ancient walls. He opened the journal of the last keeper, Harold Strayer, again. The yellowed pages and musty smell made each word a plunge into the past. Harold wrote with palpable urgency and fear, describing the origin of the lighthouse, the ritual that sealed it, and the terror he had faced. According to Strayer, the creature was an interdimensional entity, a being that transcends human concepts of space and time. She feeds on fear, sanity, and life, living between worlds through rifts that open into the depths of the sea. The lighthouse, in turn, was not just a physical construction, but a magical seal, a beacon of vigilance that kept the sunken eye away. The following pages contained reports of strange occurrences, disappearances of fishermen, shadows moving beneath the surface, and, most importantly, the growing fear among the residents of nearby villages. Harold described how the lighthouse's green light, fueled by ritual crystals and consecrated blood, acted as a shield, but that its power depended on constant care and maintenance. The light could never go out. Dylan realized that the beacon had been turned off, perhaps recently. That explained the recent manifestations. The sunken eye had not been re-imprisoned, merely kept in precarious containment. As he read, a strange sound made him look up. The lighthouse seemed to breathe, the green light pulsing more intensely, almost like a heart. A feeling that something was watching him took hold. He felt a presence behind him, an icy cold that pierced his skin. He turned slowly, seeing nothing but the dark emptiness of the stairs. But he knew he was not alone. Hours passed between writings, sounds, and heavy silence. The diary spoke of a price to be paid, of ancient sacrifices to keep the seal intact. And now, with the maintenance failing, the balance was broken. Dylan understood that he was not just a curious person. He had become part of this story, trapped in an ancient web where time, fear, and reality were confused. The sunken eye was not just a threat. It was a guardian of secrets that man should never have awakened.